Hey guys, my name is Marcus, and this is Regeneration Radio. This is something that we've tried to do for several months now. We're really wanting to use our multimedia platforms to reach as many people with the good news of the gospel as we possibly can. And so that's what this channel is really going to be all about. It can cover a variety of topics. We're going to try to broadcast on a multitude of media platforms, whether it be through podcasting, video logs like something such as what you'll see today, interviews, music. We'll do everything that we can across every platform just to push the word and the message of the good news of the gospel out there. And so again, this is just really the beginning of our channel. And so I have a presentation today that I really think is going to be informative to you. And so just kind of off the very top, I just want to set the tone for you guys. We are in the middle of March. This is 2022. Obviously right now all the buzz is surrounding the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And so, I don't know if I have felt the geopolitical tensions as high as they are right now in quite some time. Obviously, I was very young when I lived through the Cold War in the early 80s, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, and really the fall of what we would call communism in Russia and Eastern Europe. And so I really believe that what we're seeing today is a very unique geopolitical dynamic that could have ramifications and could create a kind of a chain reaction of events that could lead to, at the very least, further instability in the Middle East. Obviously, where I come from a prophetic point of view, is that the Bible is an Israel-centric book, Jerusalem-centric even furthermore, as God has so chosen to uniquely attach himself and his name and his dwelling right there on that mountain, what we would call Mount Zion, or there in the city of Jerusalem. And so when I look at Bible prophecy and I look at the fulfillment of Bible prophecy in the future, I always start in Israel, Jerusalem, Israel, what we call the epicenter. Then we kind of broaden our concentric circles beyond that. And so when I'm looking at Russia, I'm looking at Ukraine, I'm looking at everything that's happening right now, obviously Israel is front and center in my mind. And there's so many unique geopolitical dynamics at work, as I have said, that it would be a whole episode in and of itself to really determine what's going on within the Middle East, with Russia, with Ukraine, with the United States of America, with countries like Iran who are ramping up their own military, flexing their own military muscles, as it were. So you have Russia and the U.S. Russia's brokering the nuclear deal with Iran. You have the United States putting sanctions on Russia now, leading with the NATO alliances to sanction Russia. You've got Israel, who has better relationship with Russia than they do Iran, obviously, and so they're kind of stuck in the middle of all of this, and the United States is the wild card. And so when I think about what's happening right now, I think about it in terms of, number one, what we're seeing in Russia and the Ukraine. These are but the wars and rumors of wars that Jesus told us about, that these would be the beginning of sorrows. I do believe that we can view the general signs of birth pains in light of war, famine, all types of earthquakes and catastrophes, and those things that are evidence of the beginning of sorrows, or the beginning of that time leading up to the very end of this age. And so I'm not an alarmist in the sense that we're about to go into World War III, but at the very same time, I recognize with everything that has happened in the last 70 years, much less the last 2 years, I am of the opinion that we are nearing that final 7-year or so period, that final Shabua, or as Daniel called the 70th week. I really do believe that we are fast approaching that time. And so my presentation today is really is dealing with a question, and that question is, are we living in the last generation? And so over the course of the next several weeks, I'm going to be doing some presentations that have to do with what I'm calling the convergence of all things. And so if you can imagine all of these different elements that are at work right now in our world, in this modern society, and all of these things are coming together rapidly at the very same time. We're going to talk about Israel today, just the rebirth of the nation state of Israel, and where it falls in one of the necessary fulfillments of the end of the age. But also there are so many other things when it comes to the advent of technology, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering. We're looking at spiritual apostasy all over the world. We are looking at a resurgence in the collective desire to be in tune with the supernatural, with occultism, with spiritualism. We're seeing things such as the UFO phenomenon and the UFO alien abduction phenomenon, and all of these things that are kind of happening. The disclosure from our U.S. government and other agencies now acknowledging that yes, there are unidentified flying objects, craft that cannot be explained within our own laws of physics or technology. So there's all these other things that are happening. The geopolitical, the dynamics taking place there in and around the Middle East and all over the world. The rise of globalism, the pursuit of the global elite to accomplish their agenda called the Great Reset, or to see a complete economic reset into a brand new industrial revolution. Really, it's the digital revolution. And so all of these things are converging at such an exponential rate. And so I just want to be able to kind of take each of them one at a time and give you some examples of modern events and modern realities that in our culture today that I believe are signs and evidence that we are living in the last days, and that we are living as the last generation, or within the scope of the last generation. And so what I want to do today, I have a PowerPoint that I want to share with you today, and we're going to cover several scriptures and things of that nature. But I'm just going to work through this PowerPoint with you today, just to kind of answer some questions about, are we living in the last generation? And so if you'll give me just a second, I'm going to get my screen ready and open up my PowerPoint. And so here you can see that this is part one of what I'm calling my Convergence series. And so the title of this session, is the fig tree generation. And so I'm looking at this from a perspective of something that you may be familiar with in the scriptures. Jesus spoke about it specifically concerning the fig tree in the nation state of Israel. And so let's just kind of walk through some of these slides. We're going to be able to look at some of these scriptures together as well. And so there's a prophecy, what I would call a prophecy or a parable, that is really, it really is carried through the entire testimony of Scripture, beginning in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Hebrew text, and then also reinforced and reaffirmed by Jesus and the apostles when we began thinking about the nation state of Israel, and how the nation state, the covenant people of Israel, the ethnic people of Israel living in the land of Israel underneath the governance of the leaders of Israel, this idea that is correlated, or it is connected to, metaphorically, what we call the fig tree. And so here's my question number one, what does the rebirth of the nation state of Israel have to do with end times prophecy? So again, when we're looking at the convergence of all things, we would expect that if the nation state and the rebirth of the modern state of Israel has anything to do with end times prophecy, then we would see that, number one, very clearly established in the Scriptures. And as we're going to see here in just a minute, I believe that is established in the Scriptures. And then the next question is this: did the rebirth of the state of Israel start the prophetic clock for the final generation? So now we're talking about timing, and as we'll see in a minute, the rebirth of the nation state of Israel, 1948, following World War II, and basically the coalescence of the United Nations, or the League of Nations. And it was at that time, out of really one of the worst times of within the history of the Jewish people. It is when the state of Israel, the nation of Israel, was reborn in 1948, and we're going to see the significance of that. So my question really would be, if there's a connection here, and we're looking at timing, could it be that the rebirth of the nation state of Israel did something to trigger the start, or to reset or to restart the prophetic clock, as it were, for the final generation? And so we're going to take a look at some of these scriptures that I think are very, very relevant. So we're going to look at Mark 11. Mark 11. So we're going to go Mark 11, verse 12. So I'm going to go there first. And what you see here, we have the triumphal entry, and this is nearing the end of the life of Jesus, as he's headed back toward Jerusalem. We see him entering the city, and the people crying out from Psalm 118, "Lord, save us now, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And then you see that in verse 12 of Mark 11, it says, "On the following day, when they came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it," so now he's speaking to the fig tree. Obviously, this has so much more significance than him. Jesus is just getting angry at a fig tree who that just so happens does not have fruit on it, because it's not the time for it to have fruit. It wasn't the season for it to have figs. So Jesus didn't expect it to have figs. Nonetheless, he curses the fig tree as an example. So we see that he curses the fig tree as an example. Excuse me. All right, so now we're going to run to Matthew 21. We're going to see kind of a parallel passage here in Matthew. And so let me see where we are. We're going to be Matthew 21, verses 18 through 22. So look at verse 18. "In the morning he was returning to the city. He became hungry. He, seeing a fig tree by the wayside, he went to it and found nothing on it but only leaves. And he said, may no fruit ever come from you again. And the fig tree withered at once. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled and said, how did the fig tree wither at once?" And so again, these are just some parallel passages. And then finally in Matthew 24, verses 32 through 35, you're going to see, I'll tell you what, let's go to Luke first. So if we go to if we go to Luke 21, let's look at that. Just want to be real thorough when it comes to establishing this case, because it's very important that we establish this case. So in Luke 21, again, he's telling a parable. Okay, he says, look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already near. So also when you see these things taking place, know that the kingdom of God is near. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all has taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And so this is the passage from Luke 21. This is also seen in Matthew chapter 24, that Jesus has just come out of Jerusalem. He sees a fig tree. He curses the fig tree because it doesn't have any fruit, which is a little bit strange because they shouldn't expect it to have fruit. Nonetheless, Jesus curses the fig tree. And then just a couple of passages later, in a short time later, Jesus is bringing up this fig tree to his disciples again. And when you start to put these pieces together, you begin to pick up on the language. There's a reason why Jesus is using this illustration of the fig tree, because he wants the disciples to make a direct connection between this fig tree, the one that he's speaking of, and using parables, metaphorically speaking, to refer to the nation state of Israel, to the leadership of the Jewish people, specifically at that time, okay? And so look at Luke 13, verses 6 through 9. It says again, he's telling another parable about a fig tree. This is Jesus. He says, a man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. And he said to the vine dresser, now you remember in his other parable in Matthew 15, it says, I am the vine, and my Father is the vine dresser or the gardener. So again, consider what's happening here. He came to the vine dresser. He said, look, for 3 years now, I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree, and I find none. So cut it down. Why should it waste up the ground or use up the soil, right? And so the vine dresser, he answered him, and he said, sir, let it alone this year until I dig around it and put on manure, and then if it should bear fruit next year, well and good, but if not, you can cut it down. And so again, we're seeing this imagery. Again, Jesus isn't just interested in horticulture or farming or agriculture. Excuse me, I should have said agriculture. He's not necessarily just interested in why this tree is this fig tree is producing fruit. Notice how he said for 3 years. For 3 years he had come seeking fruit. You know, most people believe that Jesus' ministry, official ministry, lasted somewhere between 3 and 3.5 years, and it's almost like he's pronouncing it. For 3 years I've been performing miracles, and I have proven myself with authority to be the Son of Man and the Messiah of Israel, and yet there's still no fruit. The majority of the leaders rejected him. Many of the people rejected him. And so Jesus is getting frustrated with the fact that the people of Israel, who should have anticipated and expected and recognized their Messiah more than anyone else, they by and large missed the coming of the Lord, the coming of the Messiah. And so this brings us to just a few chapters later in the Gospel of Matthew, from when he cursed the fig tree. Now look at what Jesus says just before he enters into Jerusalem. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you are not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate." Now this is the key. "For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Jerusalem, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, why is this significant? All right, let's kind of stop and let's put this together up until this point, right? Jesus is going to the cross. The leadership of Israel is conspiring against him. The majority of the people are going to be yelling, "Crucify him." He is going to be rejected by his own people when they should have been the ones to embrace him the most in expectation of the coming of Messiah. So his heart is broken, and he's pronouncing a curse upon Jerusalem and the leadership of Israel. And he's saying, listen, because you have rejected me, I have come to gather you to myself, but you weren't willing. You're going to be held responsible. Your generation is going to be held responsible for rejecting me. And because of this, your house will be left desolate. And then Jesus is saying that and you won't see me again until you acknowledge who? The leadership of Israel, the leadership of the Jews in Jerusalem, until you acknowledge that you were wrong, that you denied and rejected your Messiah, your Savior, your Messiah ben Joseph, the suffering servant. You rejected him. You nailed him to a cross. You conspired with the rulers to nail him to the cross. And because of your rejection, your house is going to be left desolate, which it was. We're going to see that in a minute. And he says, and until you recognize this and you call upon my name, you call me Messiah, Yeshua of Nazareth, that you will say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Until that day happens, you will not see my face again. So this is a significant pronouncement. And you're going to see why this matters. Again, so you're putting the connection to the fig tree and Israel, the nation state, the governance of Israel. He's putting the connection to their rejection of him as the fruitlessness of the fig tree, that he comes to a fig tree, finds no fruit, so it's not worth anything. It's time for it to be cut down and left desolate. He pronounces a judgment on the leadership and over even the house, the sanctuary, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, that it will be left desolate. And that is exactly what we saw, historically speaking, in 70 AD when Jerusalem was once again besieged by the Romans, with legions of armies from the Middle East joining the Romans as mercenaries who were bloodthirsty for the destruction of Jerusalem and the annihilation of the Jewish people. And so they successfully breached the walls, they burned the city, they destroyed the temple. And from that point forward, from 70 AD, just as Jesus had predicted, their house had been left desolate. And the people in Israel were basically exiled. The Jews were scattered again throughout the nations. There was no functioning governance or temple worship in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a wasteland, and the land of Israel was a desolate land. And so the predictions and the prophecy of Jesus turned out to be true because of what happened. And so remember, he said, your house will be left desolate, and you will not see me again until you call upon me and you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Okay, so now let's go back to this idea of the fig tree. Now, I could give you all of these statistics about the rebirth or the budding of the fig tree, which would be the nation state of Israel. And I'm not going to go through all of these notes, but the bottom line is this. After the destruction of Jerusalem, nearly 1900 years transpired before something began to happen, and the Jewish people began to feel a calling to return to the land. Now, this would have been ridiculous. This would have been ludicrous for people to want to go back to a barren wasteland and the shambles of a city that once was Jerusalem, and very much underneath Muslim control for hundreds of years, underneath Ottoman control. And so near the turn of the 20th century, right near the late 1800s, you begin to see this movement, this Zionist movement for the people of God, the covenant people of Israel, the Jewish people specifically, the remnant of God's ethnic people, to return to the land, which again then led to the horrors of the Holocaust in World War II, which led to then in 1948, coming out of the horrors of the Holocaust, the State of Israel was born in May of 1948. The Jews proclaimed an independent state of Israel, and a nation was born in a day as prophesied, referring to the book of Isaiah. And then Israel began to defend its own land, and the nation state of Israel was reborn against all odds, against any likelihood that this could ever happen. This is one of the most significant prophetic events in all of human history, because for the very first time, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, were back in the land, governing their land, governing Jerusalem, and eventually got more control of Jerusalem in 1967 in the Temple Mount. And so you begin to see that 1948, 1967, these are significant days, significant years in the rebirth of the nation state of Israel. And so here's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm coming from this idea that Jesus is correlating the nation state of Israel, the leadership of Jerusalem, with the fig tree. And he's saying, because you rejected me and I did not find fruit on you, and you were not willing, I left your house to you desolate. And there was a 1900-year period where there was desolation, and the people were scattered once again. However, Jesus tells us in the Olivet Discourse that when you see the leaves of the fig, remember, he cursed the fig tree. It withered, it died, right? It was left desolate. But Jesus is now bringing attention to his Olivet Discourse, and he's saying, listen, when you see the leaves bud and put forth, the tree begin to put forth leaves and begin to bud as if spring is here and the tree is coming back to life, he's saying, you know that summer is near. He said, and in the same way, when you see all of these things taking place, in other words, when you see all of these signs of the end taking place, including the abomination of desolation and the great tribulation and the gospel being taken to all nations and the persecution of God's people, and all of the cataclysmic signs of the end and the judgments of the end, he says, when you see all of these things taking place, understand that this generation will not pass away until everything is accomplished. So what I'm proposing today, as far as one of the elements of convergence that we have seen manifest in this generation within a lifetime, from 1948, maybe you want to say 1967, when the Jews regained control over Jerusalem, somewhere within this modern era, we have seen the leaves of the fig tree put forth leaves again. The fig tree is putting forth leaves. It's budding its leaves again, which tells us that the clock, that the fig tree is coming back to life, that Israel has been reborn again, and the fig tree is alive in the land again. The people are coming back. They're governing the land again. We have leadership from Jewish people in the land of Israel, in the city of Jerusalem. So that is an indication that according to Jesus' fig tree prophecy or fig tree parable, that we are living in the last generation. We're living in that generation, that general time frame within a lifetime of when we see the fig tree blooming again and when we see the end of all things take place, even the return of Jesus. So this is an exciting time when you understand the significance of the rebirth of the nation state of Israel. Also, when you look at all of the judgment prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures concerning the prophets, they're always talking about the siege of Jerusalem, the day of the Lord, the battle of Armageddon, the final judgment of God's enemies always incorporates this collective coalition of nations, surrounding nations, neighboring, hostile nations that are invading the land again. They're invading Jerusalem again underneath the leadership of who we would call Gog of Magog, or the Antichrist, the beast. And so this picture is, how could there be a convergence of nations and military conflict in and around the land of Israel, and specifically Jerusalem, if there was nobody in the land, if the Jews were not back in the land, living in the land, governing the land as a nation state, as the nation state of Israel. And so this is one of the prophecies that had to be fulfilled in order for there to be any geopolitical dynamics that could possibly take place. that is clearly portrayed in the Old Testament prophets, and even with Jesus and the apostles as well. And so we see how significant these things are. Now I want to walk with you through just a couple of text and passages from what I call the Hebrew Scriptures, just to make sure you understand this is not just something that Jesus mentioned, but the Hebrew Scriptures also draw this connection and this metaphorical correlation between Israel and the fig tree. So here I'm going to give you a couple of Jeremiah 24. Look at what Jeremiah the prophet says. He says, "Then the word of the Lord came to me. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel." Okay, the God of Israel. "Like these good figs, so I will regard as good the exiles from Judah, whom I have sent away from this place to the land of the Chaldeans. And I will set my eyes on them for good, and I will bring them back to this land. And I will build them up and not tear them down. I will plant them and not pluck them up. And I will give them a heart to know that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, for they shall return to me with their whole heart." Again, the Lord is drawing a correlation with Israel as being like figs, and in regard to the Babylonian exile, and even as a type of the gathering at the end of the age, he is drawing this correlation that the good figs are those who are obedient to him, who trust in him, that he will bring back to the land, he will plant and build up in the land, and people will return to the Lord with their whole heart. So what an amazing prophecy that has something to do with the fig tree parable, as Israel is Israel is often portrayed metaphorically as the fig tree. Hosea, prophet Hosea, chapter 9, verses 8 through 10. The prophet is the watchman of Ephraim with my God, yet a fowler snare is on all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. They have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days. I don't know exactly how to misprint there, but he will remember their iniquity, and he will punish their sins. Like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel. Like the first fruit on the fig tree in its first season, I saw your fathers. But they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to things of shame, and became detestable like the thing that they loved. And so, again, there's just another picture of how Israel is connected metaphorically to the fig tree. And you can go back and read Habakkuk 3, Zechariah 3, Jeremiah 8, 1 Kings. These are all passages that I believe also support this notion, or this parable, that Israel is indeed referred to as the fig tree in Scripture. So let's talk real quickly about a generation. Now, this is an extra perspective, or really an additional perspective that I feel like is also connected to this entire idea of the fig tree. Okay, so I'm operating from a prophetic perspective, and I don't have a whole lot of time to go into the details, but just to kind of give you a very general summary, is that I look at biblical history, and really all of redemptive history, from the redemption of mankind, from the creation to the redemption and the culmination of human history. I believe that the Bible has given us a very clear prophetic timeline that there has been and will be, in the end, about 6,000 years of human history. Okay, about 6,000 years from Adam to the return of Jesus Christ. Now, when you look at what the Scriptures say that a day with the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. And so what is the Bible giving us? The Scriptures are giving us a key to unlock a prophetic truth that I believe is very, that the case is very easy, not easy, but a very strong case to establish that there are 6,000 years of redemptive history, human history, or 6 days if a day is equal to 1,000 years. And during this time, you basically have from Adam to Abraham, there's generally about 2,000 years. From Abraham to Jesus, or the coming of Yeshua, was generally about 2,000 years. And then from Jesus' first coming to his second coming, to the end of this age, there will be another 2,000 years. and then the end will come. Then we will enter into that final 7-year period, that final week, as it were, of great trouble and tribulation leading up to the return of Jesus Christ. And so we see in this understanding of 1,000 years is like a day with the Lord, and a day is like 1,000 years. I believe that gives us a very good indication that Jesus was born and he came on the scene about 4,000 years into human history from Adam. There's been about 2,000 years since his death, burial, and resurrection. If we just assume for a moment that Jesus' ministry lasted somewhere between 30 and 33 AD, just by our own, renderings and time calendars and modern time and keeping and all that. We're just going to say, for argument's sake, it's from 30 to 33 AD, the life and ministry of Jesus leading to his death, burial, and resurrection, which means that we could expect and should expect the end of the age to be about 2,000 years. I don't know if we're talking exactly 2,000 years according to God's timetable, but generally speaking, about 2,000 years after the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ, we would expect the end of the age to occur, those last 2 days, Jesus to return to establish his 1,000-year reign, or his millennial reign on the earth, or his final day of ruling and reigning and resting, the final Sabbath, as it were, for us to enjoy a 1,000 years of kingdom living in this earth, on this earth, with King Jesus on the throne, and that would complete the 7,000-year cycle of human history. And then, of course, we would enter into what we call the 8th day, or the eternal state, or whatever it may be. And so this is a very critical component to understanding the timeline of the prophetic timeline of God's redemptive history. So I'm just saying, for argument's sake, that if Jesus, his death, burial, and resurrection was somewhere around 30 to 33 AD, then we could expect the final 7-year period to begin, at the very least begin somewhere around 2030 to 2033. So I'm not setting a date, because no one knows the day, the specific day, nor the hour. It's like looking for the moon in the night sky as we await the sighting of the new moon and the Feast of Trumpets. We don't exactly know the day or the hour, but we know the general season, and that's what Jesus is telling us in the fig tree prophecy. When you see all of these things taking place, know that the end is near, and I'm at the very gates, I'm at the very door, and this generation will not pass away until it is all accomplished and is all completed. So you don't know the day, you don't know the hour, but you do know the general season, that summer is near, Christ's return is getting near, and I believe, brothers and sisters, we are in that generation, and we're beginning to see that maybe in the next 10 to 15 years, I believe that we will be at a point where it will be the end of this age. We will be entering into the time of sorrows. We will be very likely moving into the time of great tribulation, with the rise of the beast and the persecution of the saints, and the judgments of God during the great tribulation, and that we very well could be entering into that time a lot sooner than we may be ready, or that we could ever really be ready to expect. And so that's really where I'm coming from when it comes to this element of convergence, the nation state of Israel, the rebirth in 1948, understanding that that's the budding of the fig tree, that the nation state of Israel had to be reborn. The people had to be back in the land. The governance had to be back in Jerusalem. The Jewish people had to be ruling their own land in order for these things to begin, that clock to begin to start for the last generation. And so that's where I believe we are. So I guess the last question to answer is, well, how do you define a generation? Well, there's really a lot of different ways to define a generation. So how long is a biblical generation? Well, I can't tell you that I have a very specific or confident answer. I think that a lot of it has to do with context. I think some of it has to do with just how the word is used throughout Scripture, but I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions, okay? Possible generation durations in the Bible. Just a general definition, a generation is the lifetime of a person or a group of people. And so like when all of Joseph's generation passed away in Egypt, there arose a new Pharaoh, and once that Joseph and all of his generation were dead, then obviously a new Pharaoh arose and began to persecute God's people in Egypt. So that's one way to look at it. The scriptures in Genesis 15 talk about Israel going into Egypt for a land that's not their own for 400 years, and then the Lord correlates 400 years with Abraham as 4 generations. So that would lead us to believe that a generation could last 100 years. Again, the lifetime of a person, at most would be about 100 years. And so that's a very good indication. So let's just say from 1948 to 2048, 100 years, that would be a generation from when the fig tree began to bud again until all of these things were completed. We could be in a 20 some odd year window. Or you can look at it from all of these different perspectives. 70 years is as significance in the Bible as we do know. So 70 years could be a generation. 40 years or the general time that it takes to procreate or sexually reproduce, that could be a generation. And so I know that there's not a solid answer for how we define a generation, but I'd just say at the very most, we're looking at from the rebirth of the nation state of Israel in 1948, or the rebirth of, or the reclamation of Jerusalem by the Jewish people in 1967. At the most, we're talking 100 years from those dates, or from one of those dates. So, we're in the 2048 to 2067 range. I believe that there's a good case that could be made that a generation is shorter than that. But either way, we are getting close. And I believe that the scriptures are very, very clear that we are getting very, very close. And so I wanted to share all of that with you guys because it gives us a good perspective of what is the significance of the rebirth of the nation state of Israel? How does it affect God's prophetic clock and his prophetic timeline? How is it connected to this final generation? And so again, just one of the threads that is running at exponential speed right now and converging with all of these other elements that I believe is giving us clear and abundant evidence that we are living in that unique generation. And so I hope that you guys have enjoyed this message, and we're again going to continue to share these videos as often as we can. Please like and subscribe our page. Share it with as many friends as you can. That helps us out tremendously. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you with Regeneration Radio. God bless. Have a great day.